Hey, this is Nick Milvoy.
And this is Jason Shadrick.
This is the 100 Guitarists podcast, where each week we're talking about one of the 100 guitar players that we think you should know. This week we have a very special guest here to talk with us about the guitarists of the Allman Brothers.
That's right. We're packing a few into this one. Obviously, we're talking about Dwayne. We're talking about Dickey. We also touch on some of the other guitar players that flew through the Allman Brothers over the years.
That's right. And we don't spend too much time talking about Derek because he got his own episode.
That's right.
So, all right. And so our special guest, set that up a little bit, is none other than acclaimed journalist Alan Paul, who is, a veteran guitar journalist. He also is very involved in the Allman Brothers world. He's written 2 books on the Allman Brothers, as well as other books, including one on Steve Ray Vaughan. That's really great. And Alan also leads the band Friends of the Brothers, which I saw a couple months ago, and man, they sounded great. So we're very excited to have Alan here with us today, fellow New Jerseyan. Sorry, Jason.
Woo.
But before we talk to
I'll
Alan,
just be over here pumping my own gas.
Like a sucker. Before we get to Alan, we'd like to remind you can get at us by calling or leaving a voicemail, or sending a text to 319-423-9734, or hit us up on email 100guitarists@premierguitar.com. And while you're thinking about all that stuff, communicating with us, we love when you rate and review our podcast wherever you're listening to your podcasts. Subscribe, don't forget that, and hit us up on the Premier Guitar YouTube channel. Subscribe there and give us some likes.
There we go. And today's episode is brought to you by the Rocky Mountain Slide Company. Of course, we're going with the slides today. We're talking Allman Brothers. Big shout out to Doc over there at Rocky Mountain Slide Company. He sent Nick and I some goodie bags full of slides, full of picks. I'm a huge fan of their picks. All different sizes and shapes and materials that I haven't experimented with before. So those are super cool. But Nick, you have a couple slides in hand. Tell us about
I got a
those.
couple right here. Each episode I've been trying to show. Doc's catalog is so vast. He's got so much stuff that he offers, and they're all really different sizes, different materials, all that stuff. And I realized I've shown some of the metal slides, some of the natural materials. Here's one I haven't shown off yet. This is an aged bell brass slide. And can you see that? There we go. Aged bell brass. Really cool looking. Looks like it's been in use for 100 years. Got the Rocky Mountain logo right there.
Oh, rounded tip. Single in there. This is a nice slide. I like it. It's got a good weight to it. And then I wanted to show some of these picks. Jason's been talking about the picks. I've come around on these picks. I've gotten into the picks. There's a lot to check out here. This material, you see that right there? Oh yeah, I like those.
When I first looked at these, I thought these looked like my blue chip, and I gotta say, I'm a big blue chip pick user. These really check that box for me. They're a really nice shape. They're a similar feeling material, and every one is a little bit different. So, here's the one. Check out this one.
Oh yeah,
you see that? Yeah. So good grip spot, and it's that familiar material. Really nice beveled edges. You can kind of grip it from either side. Makes sense with the way he bevels the edges. Yeah, I'm really into these picks. So, I've shown you these before. These still sit on my desk. These are my most recent slides I've been using. But man, Doc has so many slides. So whatever your slide tastes and preferences are, head over to Rocky Mountain Slides. Check out something. There's so much. Get yourself a goodie bag.
That's right. So we're gonna cut now to our talk with acclaimed Allman Brothers scholar. When this came up on the schedule, I was like, there's only one guy.
Yeah, no
we
discussion.
should talk to. And he has some great stories, some great insights that he learned from being embedded in the Allman Brothers camp for decades now. So here's our chat with Alan Paul. Well, today's episode is all about the Allman Brothers, and as soon as I saw this episode coming up on the schedule, I knew there was one guy we had to talk to, probably and arguably the foremost authority on the Allman Brothers who hasn't officially been in the band.
Thank you.
Go with that.
Thank you.
The source.
Yeah, right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Kirk West was never officially in the band, and he was my mentor in becoming an Allman Brothers expert, but he was employed by the band for many years. So
there we go.
That might count as being in the band.
So when did your love for the Allman Brothers really start to blossom? Obsession? Is that a fair obsession? Love? Where did it start from?
Well, yeah. Obsession at various parts of my life is certainly accurate, but not when my love began to blossom. I wouldn't say it was an obsession, but it's kind of funny to look back on because, as a kid, I grew up in the 70s. I was music obsessed. I had an older brother, and he and his friends were music obsessed. A couple of his friends were great guitar players. The first access I had to seeing like people actually playing guitar and being really good were my brother's friends. And so I had a little bit more mature taste than a lot of my peers just because of my exposure to these guys who were like high school seniors when I was in middle school. And my brother was into the Allman Brothers, and he gave me Eat a Peach. So my first of two Allman Brothers books, One Way Out, I dedicated to my brother David. Because first of all, even aside from what I'm about to say, he let me use his stereo and listen to his albums, which was a big deal in the 70s. Like, because some people just didn't want you touching their stuff. I had to buy him a new stylus occasionally because I was never as careful with the stuff as he was. But he gave me Eat a Peach and told me to listen to it. And I would just sit there and I look at that psychedelic gatefold, and I don't think I really understood psychedelics and stuff yet, but I knew it was something cool and weird and different. And I became pretty obsessed. And I was obsessed with the myth, which I've now spent much of my life debunking, that Eat a Peach was named that because Duane was killed by a peach truck on his motorcycle. I certainly believe that. And so in 8th grade, I had to pick a great American to write an essay about, and I wrote about Dwayne Allman. And
wow,
I wish I could go back and interview
about Dwayne Allman.
Yeah, I wish I could interview 8th grade me. I don't know exactly why. It was some combination of loving the music, loving the imagery, and being caught up in that mythology, which turned out to be totally BS about the peach truck. Somehow caught my imagination. And I grew up in Pittsburgh, so kids were writing about, Joe Green and Chuck Noll and Roberto Clemente, and of course George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and I wrote Dwayne Allman. So I guess my obsession goes back to there. It wasn't a straight line. I went into all kinds of other musical interests and up and down. And then what really reconnected it in a really major way was in 1990 when they had reformed with 7 Turns. They had reformed in 89, but they were really a band in 90 when they put out 7 Turns. And I was a struggling young writer, and I did a lot of writing for Tower Pulse magazine, which was a great free magazine at Tower Records. But I did a lot of their blues stuff, some cool stuff. I interviewed Earl King, which is something I look back on in sort of amazement because I met him in New Orleans. But I begged them to write about the Allman Brothers, and I did that. And it was my first sort of more mainstreamy thing for them. And I just went so deep. I went and bought the Dreams box set. I had no money, so it was a huge expenditure for me. I bought it, cash money out of my pocket, and listened to it over and I was underemployed, so I could really throw myself into articles. I must have listened to that Dream box set and looked at the photos and read the liner notes, 50 times. And that was what really started me. And I interviewed Greg and Dickey, and they said I had to interview the new guys. That was Warren Haynes and Alan Woody at the time. And then on my own, I tracked down Phil Walden and Tom Dowd, the great producer who produced that. And I wrote that it was really definitely the best thing I had ever written to that point, as I got just so into it and so obsessed. And that article played a big role in me getting hired at Guitar World the next year in 1991, because it was like my lead clip, and I would send things out. And then I became slowly, surely, and then deeply close with Kirk West, who was the band's tour mystic, was his title. He was the tour manager and also the archivist and photographer. He was the one who had produced and put together that Dreams box set, which I still think, he did a marvelous job as one of the highlights of the great box set era. And so it was my friendship with Kirk and then my relationship with him that brought me from being like a regular journalist writing about the band to more of an insider. So he started hiring me to like work with him on the archival releases, write liner notes, and I got to go into the tape vaults with him. And through him, I started being at the shows and meeting all the crew. And so when I would interview Dickey, initially I came in through Guitar World, so it was a lot of Dickey and Warren and Alan Woody, and Greg, just because he was Greg, and they would see me around at the shows, Dickey and Greg. And so when it came time to do interviews, I don't know if they always knew exactly who I was at first, but they were like, "Oh, that guy, the Kirk guy. Okay, we'll talk to him." And so it was a slow build, and I was 25 years or so into that, or maybe at least before I wrote One Way Out. And I didn't. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a 25-year plan to write a book. But as it turns out, with those guys, and I'm not really talking about Warren or Woody, the younger guys, but like with Dickey and Greg, they had been burned by journalists so many times. They were pretty suspicious. Like you almost did need 20 or 25 years of being around and proving not to be a snake, I guess, for them to trust you. So it's just kind of a crazy story. That's how it unfolded.
Nice. So you also play guitar. When did your guitar interests and your Allman Brothers interests kind of come together? Were you playing guitar when you first wrote that 8th grade paper?
No.
Okay.
I wish I was, because like I said, I had access to some brilliant guitar players and my brother's friends who could have taught me. I started tinkering around a little bit with guitar in towards the end of high school and then in college. And I got so deep into music before I really played that in a weird way, it was a detriment to me playing in those early years because I was hanging out with all these musicians and I knew more than I could do. And so I would almost be embarrassed to start playing. And I didn't really throw myself into it until I was, I guess, 24. I mean, I had played plenty, but when I got hired at Guitar World, because then I was surrounded by all these great players and I really was like, I got to up my game a little bit. And so I started taking lessons really for the first time. And I had friends show me things before that, but I never had a teacher who I sat down with when I was a kid taking piano lessons. And I sort of approached it that way. And it's been bumpy. I'm self-taught, and so in fact, I remember in my early lessons, my guitar teacher being confused by me because I could play certain things really well, and I sound like really well for a beginner, say that. Like it was still relative, but I sounded not like a beginner. And then he would try to teach me new things, and I'd be like, I'm really like a rank beginner. And he was like, I don't understand why you can do A so well and you're struggling with B, which seems easier. And that was just my weird way of learning. So I was intimidated by the Allman Brothers music. And then when I started playing and I was in my performing out more, I was singing, I actually avoided a lot of Allman Brothers music because I always felt like music was open to interpretation if I'd sing blues or Bob Dylan or things like that, or sort of writing songs in those veins. But with the Allman Brothers, the Greg vocals especially were so in my mind that when I didn't hit them just right, they bothered me in a way that not hitting other things didn't. So I sort of shied away from a lot of Allman Brothers stuff until One Way Out came out. Then people like who read the book and were Allman Brothers fans, I started having that following sort of in that world more. They would come to my gigs and be like, where's the Allman Brothers? So I threw myself into, some of that music.
And is that demand what led to you forming Friends of the Brothers?
No, so Friends of the Brothers never was a plan exactly. That was another band I had with my more of a local Maplewood band. When Butch Trucks died in 2017, I was devastated by it, and I had a gig that weekend with my local band, and I scheduled for months, and then I just changed it to a tribute to Butch Trucks. Um, Not really as like a commercial venture. It was just like he was so on my mind, and so and the club was packed, with all these Allman Brothers fans came out because we were all sort of mourning, I mean, not sort of, we were mourning. And Junior Mack, who's an old friend of mine, who was very much playing with JMO, was a very frequent guest of the Allman Brothers.
Yeah.
He,
Amazing guitar player.
Yeah, amazing guitar player, amazing singer. He lives in New Jersey, and he came to the gig and was just sitting at the bar having a drink. In fact, my bass player whispered to me, "Isn't that Junior Mack at the bar?" And I looked up, and he hadn't told me he was coming or anything. So I called him up, and he performed. And then because of the enthusiasm stuff, I'm like, we got to do a proper tribute to Butch in New York City. And so I got Live for Live Music, the website. At the time, Butch's goddaughter worked there, and we worked together and set up a tribute to Butch. And my initial idea was to have my band, and maybe I asked Junior and Andy Alador, who's a longtime friend from Guitar World, who played with Dickey for 10 years, and Peter Levin, who played keyboards with Greg for the last, I think, 5 years of Greg's life. I asked all of them, and I was just thinking if one of them showed up, that would be enough. And they all did, So then I brought in some other cats, and it was really just a tribute to Butch. That's what it was. I just because when the drummer dies, there's not always the hoopla. And I thought if I don't do a tribute to Butch in New York City, there's not going to be one. And that's why I did it. And we had so much fun, and we sold out this club, and it was a success. And so we thought, well, let's do it again, And by the time we did, it took a few months to organize another show. Greg had died. And so it was a tribute to Greg and Butch, and it never really was supposed to be a band. It just built on itself. It was completely out of love. And that's still the band, really. I mean, Peter moved to Nashville, and so he plays with us when it works. In fact, he'll be with us some shows later this summer. But me, Greg, Andy, and Junior are the core of the band, and it's been great. And we've been playing for the last year a good number of shows with JMO, who's the last surviving original Allman Brothers. So there's an old BB King song, like "You Better Not Look Down If You Want to Keep on Flying," and I had some amazing stuff happen to me when I lived in Beijing for 3.5 years. That's where I actually really became like a touring guitarist with these Chinese musicians, and it was so wild and out of the blue. And I would think, how's this happening? Then I would just say to myself, better not look down if you want to keep on flying. Like, don't reflect on it. And that's how I sort of feel now, playing these shows with JMO, especially. It's amazing. And I feel really
That's so cool.
Lucky. Yeah. And I do sometimes. I'm up there doing it, and I think about 13-year-old me writing that essay about Dwayne and imagining. And JMO used to always fascinate me as a kid because every record he would have a different name. He was like J. Johanny Johnson. Then it would be, he started adding O's. So he'd be J. Johanny Johansson. Then he was just JMO. And then sometimes he was JMO Johnson, JMO Johansson. And I remember, who is this guy? And I asked him about it. I said, how come you had a different name every record? Once got to know him, and he said, I didn't have a different name. I just spelled it different.
All right.
Awesome.
Well, we're a guitar podcast. Now we got the background out of the way, Alan. I kind of want to go through the different eras of the Allman Brothers guitar lineage with you. And I think, obviously, the place we have to start is the original lineup with Dwayne and Dickey. And they were on the first, basically kind of 3.5, 4 records. The self-titled one, Idlewild South, the Live at the Fillmore East, and Eat a Peach, which came out in 1972. And you're So you've written One Way Out, which is kind of an overall oral history of the whole band, and then you also have one called Brothers and Sisters, which is about that first album, which we're going to get to after Eat a Peach, without Dwayne. But those first 4 records seem to be like the core. When people think of the Allman Brothers Band and they think of the sound of the Allman Brothers Band, they think of those first 4 records. Now, speaking from a guitar standpoint, you've written these books. You're a musician yourself. In retrospect, what is it about those first 4 records and the magic of Dwayne and Dickey that people gravitate towards so much?
Well, yeah, and I agree with everything you said, but I would probably say when people think of them, it gets a little confusing to people because they also think of the first 5, and then that includes Brothers and Sisters, which doesn't have Dwayne, which muddles that image that some people have a little bit. But so there's a couple of things. So Dickey was in a way the secret weapon, and it's not a secret, to people like us, but most people probably listening to this podcast who are guitar oriented. Dickey did have to deal with the fact that he was this key member of a band that was named after 2 other people. And that tormented him in various ways. And I understand it to a certain extent because when we talk about, this is still a way of answering your question with the Dwayne and Dickey thing. One of the things that made them such a great team, and that did set such a template that has lasted them. It did last them through their whole band. We'll see what it was. I think 40 some years after Duane died. Is that Dickey had this incredible knack for melody. He had this incredible way of mixing major and minor keys with ease, without, I think, being super intellectual about it. And Duane had this incredible ear, so he could pick up on things immediately and jump on them, and harmonize or play counterpoint. People talk about the harmony all the time, and for good reason, but that wasn't all they did. I mean, they did a lot of counterpoint. Which is a bigger way of saying, or a more specific way of saying, they didn't have a standard rhythm lead relationship. But what's interesting about them is they did have a rhythm lead relationship. Also, they both were super grounded in being great rhythm players. And so that's a huge part of why they could each solo so well. Again, people focus on the harmony a lot with good reason, and they focus on Dwayne slide playing a lot with good reason. So I'm not downplaying either of those things, but it also was bigger than that or different than that. There was such a weave going on. Tom Doucette, who was a harmonica player, who was sort of a member of the Allman Brothers, but never officially became one because it was too much like a job, and he wanted to be able to come and go as he pleased. He's on several songs on Fillmore East. He's on Don't Keep Me Wondering, on Idle Wild South. There's a great line with his harmonica and Dwayne's slide. But he told me once, he said, I wish everyone could hear what I heard sitting behind Dickey and Dwayne's amps waiting to come on, and the rhythm they played for each other. And I think any of us who play guitar, or anyone who's even just been a thoughtful listener to great bands, understands what a great rhythm player provides to a lead player. And of course, it's more than just playing 4 chords over and over, or however many are in the song. It's all the things are tossing them in the feedback. And so they had just a very easy, instinctual relationship. And I think a lot of the credit for that, I as I said, goes to Dickey for his knack for coming up with those lines. So many of the sounds that we think of as core Allman Brothers sounds came out of Dickey's brain. Mm-hmm. I really believe. But if you back up beyond that, even before they were a band, Duane gets so much of the credit because he went out and got Dickey. They were pretty much known as the 2 hottest guitar players in the state of Florida. And remember, that we're talking about just beneath them age-wise, you had Gary Rosington and Alan Collins and Leonard Skinner. You have Tom Petty and Mike Campbell. I guess, and probably even before Mudcrutch, but proto Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. You have Stephen Stills kicking
State
around.
was full.
You have the Ledon brothers. Lead on. Is it Lead On? Duane was a big deal. Of course, he inspired all those guys, and he and Greg were out there playing from the time they were pretty young teenagers. First in Daytona Beach, and then all over, and then they were one of the first bands that went out to Los Angeles and got signed, and they were in the Allman Joys that became the Hourglass. And meanwhile, Dickey was slugging it away. He had this great band in Jacksonville called The Second Coming with Barry Oakley on bass and Reese Winans on keyboards, which is always fascinating to me, and Larry Reinhardt on guitar, who went on to be an Iron Butterfly and Captain Beyond. That's a pretty loaded bar band if you think about it. Duane was on to Barry, and he started coming down and sitting in once he was getting ready to form what became the Allman Brothers Band. He and Dickey had known each other and known of each other for years. And so something developed. Now the harmonies, I think, also came from Dickey because, Reese has told me, and it's pretty well established. I mean, they were doing some of that in The Second Coming with Dickey and Larry Reinhardt. And Dickey was a big fan of Western swing, Bob Wills and that whole world. And a lot of those harmonies came from that, the way the fiddles and the pedal steel and the guitars would play together. And so that I really do think that a lot of that came from Dickey. Most of it came from Dickey.
Interesting.
But Duane was the one, we all know what lead guitarists are like. So how many red hot lead guitarists think what I need for this band is another red hot lead guitarist?
Yeah.
To compete with me. I don't think they viewed it as competition, just to be clear, but that's how most lead guitarists would view it, is what I meant. So to share the spotlight, put it that way. And that's what Duane did. So I think Duane was the one who really had the vision. Different guys in the band have said different things about whether or not Greg was going to be the singer, whether or not he always wanted two drummers, whether or not he always planned on having another lead guitarist. J-Mo was the first guy that Duane hired. As J-Mo likes to say, I was in the band when there wasn't no band. He was the first guy. I mean, that's for sure. There's a lot of things that can be hazy, but that's not hazy. That's a fact. And J-Mo has always been a really straight shooter. He doesn't self-aggrandize, and he has a really amazing memory. I could tell you a million crazy stories about his memory and things he pulls out. He tells me that from the very beginning, Duane said, I'm going to have two drummers, two lead guitarists, and Greg's going to be the singer. So, depending on, there's different versions of how exactly that all came together, but J-Mo says it was a plan, and I believe him. So Duane was the one who had the overarching vision. And Duane had this experience already as a session player, which is interesting, right? Because there's something, some of my favorite guitar players, Duane, Jimmy Page, Jimi Hendrix, as far out as they all could get in their own ways, each of them pretty different from one another. I think they always remained rooted and to the song and what was happening. And all of them in different ways had this background as backing musicians.
Yeah.
Jimmy Page, of course, most extensively, but I mean, Duane was playing with Wilson Pickett. Jimi Hendrix was out on the road with Wilson Pickett, the Isley Brothers. I mean, Duane played with Aretha Franklin, Clarence Carter. And you can't play with people like that if you don't have a really rooted sense of the music.
Yeah.
Duane, one of my favorite of his session songs is Hey Jude with Wilson Pickett. And that was like his second session he ever played in Muscle Shoals. And Wilson Pickett was a huge star, and Duane suggested the song which was a top 10 hit for the Beatles at that time. And they all kind of like told him to shut up. And he just kept pushing and came up with that arrangement. And I think that it's so telling because the guitar playing on it, the guitar break is just brilliant.
Yeah.
So that speaks for itself to anyone with ears. But the fact that he came up with the idea, then pushed it as this brand new young session guitar player, which, you know, session musicians aren't really supposed to be suggesting songs and arrangements and stuff, especially the new guy on his second session with a star. So I think it says a lot about his personality, you know, that he would able to do that. And so that's, you know, I'm trying to cast a broad net here, but if you take all of that together, everything I just said about Dickey and what I just said about Duane, I think it explains a lot about how their guitar playing came together.
Yeah,
It does.
absolutely.
So Duane passed away in 1971, motorcycle accident. Posthumously, they released Eat a Peach. Then after that, they do a series of records where Dickey's kind of the only guitar, and a live record where Dickey's kind of the only guitar player. What was kind of like, I kind of like appreciate the fact that they didn't try and rush out and replace Duane just to have that twin guitar thing still going.
Yeah, it's an amazing little part of the history. Even before that, the 1 year, so they eventually added Chuck Leavell is what they did. But there's a year there in between Duane dying and before they added Chuck, where they just played as a 5-piece. And they just recently, one of the archival, I think the last official Allman Brothers archival release was from Syracuse, in I forget the date, but fall of 72 at the end of that 5-piece era. And it's fascinating to listen to. I find the 5-piece stuff a little sad because you can hear the whole. Oakley, you know, was a really unusual bass player. He was really inspired by Jack Cassidy, you know, Hot Tuna and you know, Jefferson Airplane, and Phil Lesh. Was really probably the first connection between the Allman Brothers and the Grateful Dead was Barry's love of Phil and that approach to playing. And so he really stepped up during that era, and he played with the craziest tone, this really rattly tone. I don't love that sound, but you know, it's part of what he was doing was trying to fill that hole and playing a very much a lead bass. And then we're getting ready to record what became Brothers and Sisters. They added Chuck, and Chuck came in via Greg. Remember, Chuck was only about, I think, 20. He had toured with Dr. John and Alex Taylor, James' brother, who was a Capricorn artist who did a couple of great records for Capricorn, at least one of which is available on streaming service and stuff. And I love it. It's worth listening to. And by the way, I interviewed James Taylor a few years ago, and he didn't know about Alex's connection to this, how Alex indirectly brought Chuck into the Allman Brothers orbit. And he was fascinated. And he's like, please tell me more. Alex was the oldest brother and the first big inspiration. But when they were touring as an opening act for the Allman Brothers, Chuck would sit behind the curtain on his electric piano while the Allman Brothers were playing and play along. And the roadies heard him, and they were telling the guys in the band, you got to hear this piano player who's playing with Alex. You know, he's incredible. He's like playing along with you guys, and it sounds so good. And so he came in, so he was working then on Laid Back, Greg's record, and that indirectly led to jam sessions, and that brought him into the Allman Brothers. Long story short, Dickey was the slowest to accept him. He used to tease him and call him Chopin, which I guess was like calling him like Mr. Fancy Pants or something. But it is really interesting. Once he came in, when I wrote Brothers and Sisters, I spent a lot of time listening to live shows of that era. And in 1973, especially, and often in 74, things started getting a little weird. But when they were at their peak in that period, and then Barry Oakley had died, he was replaced by Lamar Williams, became a different band, but they were a great live band. a great live band. And Chuck, his lead playing speaks for itself. But what was really interesting to me as I listened to more of the live stuff from that era, more in depthly on headphones and such, Chuck, his rhythm playing and comping was great, and it set Dickey up in fantastic ways, and very much in the ways that we were talking about how a rhythm guitar player does. Very inventive, very interesting chordal playing behind Dickey. And Dickey in that era, I think, was just fantastic. I mean, for a year or two there, he was like the hottest guitar player in the world. I mean, his playing was just fantastic, endlessly inventive. He picked up the burden. He started playing slide, which was incredible. You know, Greg, before things got weird with Greg and Dickey, in some of these great early mid 80s interviews I had with Greg that Kirk West actually did and turned over his tapes to me for Brothers and Sisters. Greg was just over the moon praising Dickey. Now, they played their first gig just a few weeks after Duane died. And it was almost impossible. I mean, nobody knew how they were going to do it. And he steps up and he's playing slide on Statesboro Blues and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg kept saying, you know, Dickey never played slide. He learned it in 2 weeks. It was incredible. That's not true. I mean, Dickey was already a very accomplished acoustic slide player. He can play, he could play in the style of Robert Johnson. He could also fingerpick, sort of like almost like a Blind Blake, not quite ragtime, but ragtime E style. Great acoustic player. So he was an accomplished slide player, but he hadn't played it on stage with the Allman Brothers. And as far as anyone could really tell or remember, he really had not played electric slide on stage. And then to do it, in the shadow of this mourning and the death and playing Duane's parts, I think was pretty incredible. He never became the fluid sort of slide genius that everyone recognizes Duane as. But I think if he had been playing slide in a different context, everybody would have hailed his slide playing because it was really, really good. It's just that they did do some. They didn't do that many songs going forward, new songs with his own slide parts, instead of being, covering Duane's stuff in concert. I mean, he did Wasted Words, the original demo that Greg did, he recorded with Buddy Miles and Johnny Winter. And I think Dickey played it. The slide part he played had a lot to do with what Johnny had originally done on the demo. So anyhow, and Dickey never became fully comfortable playing slide. And I think it was because of the echoes of Duane, not because of his own slide playing, which really was really damn good. Again, in a different context, if he had not been in the Allman Brothers and he just popped up playing slide the way he did, people would have hailed him as a great slide player. But instead it was like, well, he's covering Duane's parts. So it's another, just weird, weird way that Dickey's accomplishments and talents got a little skewed in the way people view it.
And I like that Wipe the Windows live record. Dickey plays some great slide on that.
Yeah. So when I mentioned how great their live stuff was, that's a really good example of it. That record, and I'm just old enough to remember it when it came out. Capricorn was sort of going down, and they overprinted. They were desperate for that record to be huge. And back in the record store days, sometimes things would pop up in the bargain bin. And they printed too many of them. It became the bargain bin, and I think we're only, people sort of said, oh, it was only whatever, what was it, 4 years, I guess, after the release of Phil Maurice. It had some of the same songs, got compared to that, and it was sort of treated as this, and then it had a kind of a weird title. The cover was a little weird. It was a graphic illustration of a car at a gas station, instead of like a picture of the band. For all those reasons, that record has sort of been discounted as not being very good. And it's sort of a shame because it turns out it's a great record. Mm-hmm. And most of the record was from Winterland. I think that's September 27th, 1973. That's the bulk of the record. And eventually when they put out the expanded Brothers and Sisters and whenever that was, they included that whole live show as a bonus disc. It's a great show. And so it occurs to me that like if they had just put it out as a show and instead of running away from Fillmore East, they should have mimicked it, and instead of calling it "Wipe the Windows Check," they should have called it the Allman Brothers Band at Winterland, and put out that show and embrace the fact that we're playing some of the same songs, but it's totally different now because we're a different band. I don't know, maybe it would have been viewed differently, but it's interesting. Again, even JMO told me while I was writing that book. He was giving drum lessons to just as it's like a friend's kid, and the kid came over with the Wipe the Windows CD, and he wanted to like learn a part off of it or something. And JMO said, "Why are you listening to that?" Because the kid said, "Because it's really good." And he put it on, and JMO called me up. He goes, "Man, you listen to Wipe the Windows? That's a damn good album." That I think it's like even the band, it's because they were like emotionally wrecked, from still really from Duane and Barry's death. And then it just sort of caught up with them around the time that came out. And so they didn't even take it seriously as like, a great album. So it's one of the things I wanted to do with Brothers and Sisters. The book actually was recast that era a little bit because it's sort of a weird deal that it was the Allman Brothers' most commercially successful era by far. I mean, they were selling out stadiums. They had a true hit single in Ramblin' Man. They had a true hit record. They were like the center of the cultural conversation, not just like a fringe band with hardcore fans. And it's been sort of overlooked, because the band had their own weird emotional hangover from the Duane and Barry era and their horribly tragic deaths. And then things ended sort of badly in 1976. And so nobody had really looked at that era that much or felt really good about it. And that's another reason to go back like to why I think Dickey's greatness at times has been overlooked, is because that was the era where he was like, this incredible ass-kicking guitar player, and it's this oddly overlooked era. So, my decision to jump into that was really inspired by a conversation with Brad Talinsky, the longtime editor of Guitar World and good friend of mine. We just, had this long conversation, and he kept saying, Brothers and Sisters, that era. It's like when the Allman Brothers ruled and nobody ever talks about it. Like, why is that? Dig into it. And it was good advice. I was a little skeptical of his original concept, but I enjoyed writing the book, and it did give me like this super renewed appreciation of that era that I don't think I had before.
Well, I think you certainly made the case for that era. And I think anybody who wants to know, it's like the go-to place is to read your book about it. And there's so much more to the Allman Brothers. It's like, what people have experienced, with Warren, what people have experienced with Derek, like all that stuff. But that time is unique. And I feel like anything I've seen about that, it's like it now that with your book, it points to that book. And that's
thank you.
People should go.
And there are these eras that became a little cloudy and disrespected that you can look back at and say, oh wow, that was better than I thought, including the next one. When they broke up in 76, they reformed in 79. And since we're, talking guitars with Dan Toller in there and Chuck gone, for complicated reasons, because Chuck was supposed to be in that. There are publicity shots that exist of Chuck, but they were having like personality disputes and there were contract fights, and Chuck had sued them for money and sued Capricorn, and everybody was still, they were on Capricorn, but they were suing Capricorn as a band and individually. It was sort of a mess on a lot of business levels. And then the era famously was becoming, not hospitable to that type of music. And they signed to Arista after Enlightened Rogues, and then they put out two pretty bad records. But and that gets compared all the time to the Dead, who did something similar. But I mean, when the Dead did Go to Heaven, which gets compared to the Allman Brothers, Reach for the Sky and Brothers of the Road all the time, but that had Althea on it, which is, I think, one of the great songs, So it's not really a fair comparison. But anyhow, I'm getting a little off track. But the Dan Toller was a great guitar player also.
Mm-hmm.
Till that point, for sure, the most like technically accomplished, sort of era appropriate, I guess, because he was really sort of an 80s guitarist, although, he came in the end of the 70s. But, player who really played fast, played really well, really clean. And that era ended badly. And so people sometimes forget, but like there's a University of Florida performance from, I think, 1979 or 80 that was well taped. And then you can go look at it on YouTube anytime. And, it's really good. And that's, again, during that era when people were, look back and say the Allman Brothers were starting to be a joke. And you go, wow. Geez, if I heard a guy get up and play like Dan Toller right like that right now in a club, I would collapse with joy.
Well, I want to wrap up by mentioning two other guitar players not named Derek and Warren, who's passed through, because Derek and Warren do get a lot of attention from that later era post-reunion time. One's Jack Pearson, who was in the band from 97 to 99. An one of the most astounding guitar players I've ever heard. I remember when he came in, he seemed like a really good fit for that time. They didn't not a lot of like live stuff out there with Jack.
No, and that's super frustrating.
Yeah.
Because there was, Kirk West worked on a Jack Pearson era archival release years ago. I assume is sitting on a shelf somewhere ready to go. And for whatever reason, it's never been put out. So, I'm glad you mentioned Jack, especially in the context of this being a guitar podcast and we're all Guitar Magazine guys. Jack is an astounding player. And by the way, a great mandolin player, probably, who knows? I mean, I've never seen him play banjo or fiddle, but like, it wouldn't shock me if you walked into the Grand Ole Opry and Jack was like ripping it up on fiddle or banjo. It wouldn't be surprising, or anything. Like, he can play any style of music genuinely, not just like he can learn it off of paper. I mean, he's a brilliant player. He was really important in that era. In 96, Warren and Alan Woody left to go Government Mule full time. The wheels were sort of coming off the band. Warren had taken on such a large role in so many ways that it was really shocking and sort of like, what's going to happen? How is this going to work? And Jack stepped in. There weren't too many people who could have. And to go back to what we had said at the beginning about Dwayne and Dickey, I mean, Jack was a brilliant rhythm player. Mm-hmm. And he gave Jack such a solid bass that was super, super, super helpful. He eventually left mostly because he was having some health problems and he was really, really struggled with the volume. He was having tinnitus and he tried to get Dickey to turn down, but good luck with that. As with many bands, including bands we've all probably played in right up into the biggest bands in the world, volume from lead guitarists is always an issue. And it was with Dickey for years. Greg didn't like it. Greg tried to get him to turn down. They wouldn't do plexiglass. I think that was a Dickey thing. They wouldn't do like plexiglass on stage or try. So it eventually pushed Jack out. And he was replaced by Derek. And then the wheels fell off after 1 year of Derek and Dickey. And Dickey went off the rails and they had this split. And, that's been pretty well documented.
Yeah.
And that could be a whole other podcast. But I honestly think, Derek was young. Derek had never really played that much rhythm. He didn't have the years under his fingers that Warren and Jack did at that point. And he played an open tuning. He's always played only an open E. I think that caused problems for Dickey because Dickey would play himself into corners and rely on Jack or Warren to catch him or lead him out. And that was a little above the pay grade of Derek at that age. I'm sure he'd do it brilliantly now. But the open tuning thing, I think, was a weird issue with Dickey because he couldn't look at him and catch he's in E.
Yeah, right.
He didn't really, the fingerings didn't make sense to Dickey. And I do think it caused some problems. But the Jack era sadly didn't last that long, but things were tumultuous. But I'm glad you brought him up. An absolutely brilliant player.
And the other guy, one of my all-time favorites, and I think we're going to be doing an episode devoted to him down the road, is Jimmy Herring, who stepped in for that one summer tour, which I would love just to hear an archival release of the Jimmy era.
Yeah, another thing that should exist. Jimmy was, in retrospect, it was only one summer really that he toured with them. And Jimmy, of course, had come through the Aquarium Rescue Unit, Colonel Bruce Hampton's Aquarium Rescue Unit, along with O'Teal, sort of along with Derek. Derek was never officially a member of the Aquarium Rescue Unit, but he was very much a Colonel Bruce disciple. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people in the Allman Brothers world joked and called it the Allman Rescue Unit. But Jimmy was fantastic. For that summer, I don't know who else really could have stepped in and saved the bacon because they had this falling out with Dickey. They could have taken the summer off of touring and tried to get it back together with Dickey in the fall, but they had the tour book, they had contracts signed, and they were determined that they were going to meet it. And Jimmy stepped up, and it's a really fun era. There are definitely some things you can find online. They brought Mountain Jam back for the first time. I was at that show. It was at New Jersey Garden State Arts Center, now PNC Arts Center. And there was a famous incident that happened after that show that's in my book, One Way Out, where
I know exactly what you're talking about. When Greg comes on the bus.
Yeah. And he was on a bus with Derek, Jimmy, and O'Teal. And Greg came on the bus and he looked at them and said, "Who's the goddamn Fish fan?" And then he walked to the back. And he came back out after about 20 minutes, apparently, and apologized and said, my brother always loved that shit, not me. And when that came out in the book, One Way Out, Jimmy called me up and he said, because Derek told it to me, it was in the book as a quote from Derek. And Jimmy called me up and he said, "I'm so glad Derek told you that story because it should be out there, but I didn't want to tell it." But yeah, it was a short but fantastic era. And then Jimmy also was a very regular guest sitting in with him.
Yeah, I remember I caught that tour that Widespread and Allmans did in probably 08, 09, somewhere in there. When I was
I think it was 09.
Yeah. And
I did too. Yeah, it was great
with each other and all that.
And just since we're talking about guitar eras, I just want to give one other shout out. I know Warren is well covered and elsewhere and stuff, but in the early first few years of Warren Dickey era, when they had reformed, was really, really fantastic. Starting in about, late 1990, once Warren had settled in and was comfortable and was really being himself, through like 93, when that's when things started to get weird for the first time of that era. And Dickey, was off the tour and on, started having subs and was going off the rails. There was a point there in 91, 92, I guess 93, and often through that whole era, but consistently for 2 or 3 years, that were just fantastic. I mean, just great. Warren was settled into the role. He was comfortable and confident, but he still had a little bit of the like, golly gee, I'm in the Allman Brothers excitement. And Dickey was playing really well, like, prime Dickey bets. And those shows were just fantastic and exciting, and really the basis of what came next. Like, I don't think if they hadn't been as strong during those few years, they wouldn't have been able to keep going until 2014. Even without Dickey and everything, because that was the period that really reestablished them as a major force, and that was all because of Warren, but also because of how great Dickey was during that era.
And I would say one of the most hard to believe, and we've covered this in a previous episode, I'm sure you're well versed in this, was the most hard to believe show maybe in Allman Brothers history was the time Zakk Wylde filled in. I mean,
yeah. Well,
whew.
And there was a funny thing about that. I was really friendly with Zakk at that time. I did a thing where I had Zakk interview the guys from Leonard Skinner, Gary Rosington, and it was still Ed King. And Zakk loved me for that. And he loved that music. And I, it was around when Pride and Glory was coming out. And I talked to Zakk pretty often. And right after he sat in with them in Boston, I talked to Zakk, and he was basically like, it was like the greatest night of his life. And then I talked to Kirk West with the Allman Brothers, and he said it was one of the most embarrassing nights in the history of the Allman Brothers.
I mean, it's out there on YouTube. People can go check it out and listen to it. But he did not try to fit in.
No,
he
was
used Zakk Wylde.
Yeah, and listen, they called him. The night before, he got on like a red-eye flight from Los Angeles, landed in Boston. They picked him up at the airport, drove him to Great Woods, and and they played their set. It's not like they said, let's have some blues jams and play, I don't know, whatever. They just played their set. And what do you expect? Kudos to Zakk. I mean, I think he did a great job being Zakk Wylde in that setting, and nobody. It's an amazing thing about the history of the Allman Brothers Band, for better and for worse. They give everyone room to be themselves, and it never occurred to anyone to say to Zakk, like, rein it in, bro, and play the songs. He did the whole thing, foot up on the. On the monitor, spitting beer in the air, stomping around the stage. And, in the context of the Allman Brothers, it all looked kind of bizarre. But my favorite part was that Butch said to him, Butch Trucks, who was pretty fiery himself, Butch said to him, "God damn it, Zakk, calm down." And Zakk said, "Bro, this is my favorite band." And and Butch said, "Yeah, it's my favorite band too. Calm the fuck down." So,
and then maybe thankfully or mercifully, David Grissom was able to get there and fill in the rest of that run.
He took over for the rest of that run,
which I would love. I've not heard any of those shows. I'm sure.
Yeah,
Grissom's told me like the first one or two, like you're kind of getting your feet under you, but man, the end of that run, I would love to hear. I
was at one of the shows with David. I'd have to look at a calendar. It was out in Western New Jersey in Sussex County. I forget the name of the place. They don't have shows there anymore. But I thought it was really good. I have not gone back and listened to it. I don't know how available it is. There was definitely an era where there were plenty of tapers in the audience, and I'm sure we could find a recording. In my memory of it, it was really good. He did a great job. I mean, it was David Grissom and Warren having fun and playing their butts off.
All right, last question, Alan, and I'm going to answer this too after you answer it. What's your biggest guitar what if in the history of the Allman Brothers?
Well, that's easy. It's what if Duane Allman had lived.
Sure. Okay, what's your second biggest one? I guess you're right. That's too obvious.
Second biggest guitar what if in the history of the Allman Brothers. I don't know. You could get really. What if they had uh, continued after Warren and Derek didn't want to play anymore with Jack Pearson and Jimmy Herring, uh, or
Mine's not far from that. Mine's close to that.
yeah, something like that. I mean, that's sort of off the top of my head. But by then, Jimmy was established in Widespread Panic and probably
Yeah.
never would have done it. But
Mine was, what if it was Jack Pearson and Audley Freed?
yeah,
You know,
yeah, that makes sense.
I thought Audley would fit into that band.
Yeah,
I mean,
and Audley was
well.
close with a lot of those guys. He and Warren are good friends. Yeah, I think the reason that What If never would make sense is that I think by 2014, when that was all happening, Jack was just no longer going to go out and play big amp shows.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there you could come up with a lot of people who could have done it. But Greg died a couple years later. Greg was only toured, I think, maybe 2 more years, and 3 years later was passed away. So any of those what ifs would have been short term anyhow.
Yeah, right. Well, Alan, thank you so much for hanging with us and teaching us and writing these books. Is there anything coming up? You said you got some gigs coming up with the Friends of the Brothers. Any other writing projects you got in the works you want to tell people about?
I'm working on some stuff with JMO that's exciting. I'm working on a revamped edition of my first book, Big in China, which tells the really wild story of my musical escapades with Chinese musicians in Beijing. And yeah, Friends of the Brothers we always got a lot going. So it's friendsofthebrothersband.com. We always got the whatever's latest and greatest. And, Warren played with us last year. O'Teal played with us. So it's always something new and exciting and fun. And it's an honor to have those guys sit in. And also, like I said, it's just fun.
Can't wait to see you guys at the Sphere. It's going to be great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, Alan.
All right. Thanks, Jason.
All right. So that was our talk with Alan Paul. Nick, you had to bail out there a little bit at the end, but Alan and I brought it home, landed the plane. And I'm glad we answered a little bit of what ifs there at the end of what are the biggest one, like he said, was what if Duane would have lived. Would have loved to hear more Duane Allman, but man, I'm really hoping someday we'll get a good quality recording of that Jimmy Herring 2000 tour.
Oh,
that's right. Yeah. That's what I'm looking for.
That's your guy. I wonder if we'll ever do a Jimmy Herring episode.
Nobody knows.
How's that for a little teaser? All right. So don't forget, you can get at us 319-423-9734. Hit us up with voicemails. Hit us up with texts. Hit us up with emails over at 100guitarists@premierguitar.com. Don't forget to rate, review, like, and subscribe wherever you're checking out this podcast, whether it's on your favorite podcast app or on the Premier Guitar YouTube channel.
Thanks again to Doc at Rocky Mountain Slides for sponsoring today's episode. Head over there, pick up some slides, pick up some picks. I think those, to me, are the easiest and quickest way to, those are your EQ. Your pick is your EQ.
Absolutely.
Right?
Just the ones I'm holding right here. Like, this one's nice and sharp. There's a Sharpie that's going to have a punchier tone. Then we have one with the soft edge. Like, man, get a bag of these, see what it does for your sound.
Dig it. All right. We'll see y'all next time.